Welcome to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. There has never been a better time for writers. More information, options, and opportunities are available to you, but navigating these requires insight. Join Mark Leslie Lefebvre as he draws upon more than a quarter century of experience as a writer, a bookseller, and a trusted book industry consultant to explore and reflect on the writing and publishing landscape to help you make informed choices on your writer journey.
Hello, Reflectives, and welcome to episode 87 of the Stark Reflections podcast. This is your host, Mark Leslie Lefebvre, and I am recording this on Thursday, July 25th. Now, this will be a solo episode where I talk about getting your book into bookstores, working with bookstores, and this may be for those of you who are more interested in what you can do with your print books as opposed to your ebooks. So if you're curious about print books, if you're curious about how to work with bookstores, this is the episode for you. But first, before we do that, I'm going to share my personal update. I'm now back up in the office, for those of you who have been following along. Liz has finished the renovations on the room. She's finished the bookshelf that's part of my desk, and my standing desk is attached to it. Now, we haven't finished attaching the top of the desk because I'm trying it out for a few days just to see where I'm going to place it. I'm probably going to get a monitor and an additional external webcam, so when I alternate between sitting and standing, I can, have a webcam depending on how I'm going to do the various videos that I do. And so we're determining where to drill the holes in the tabletop and et cetera, and just sort of get a feel for it. So yesterday, July 24th, for almost a full day of working, I was working from the desk, which was pretty good. And this morning, when I got up a little after 5:30 a.m., I started working at the desk. It's 10:30 right now, so I've been working at it for several hours. I've mostly been standing. I haven't actually been sitting at the desk. I'm not going to share pictures yet because it's still in a complete mess because it hasn't been finalized, and Liz would kill me if I shared the giant mess that I have on the desk right now. But I haven't sat down. I've stood up. I have a mat under me that she bought, sort of for tension in your back, and it's great. I got 6,000 steps yesterday just from standing at my desk and a bit of the walking around the house. But I still need a monitor. I still need a webcam. I have tested a Bluetooth keyboard as well. That's working quite well because right now I have to have the laptop up on top of my bookshelf. I've been doing some one-on-one author consultations, and I had to have the laptop up on the bookshelf in front of me, which is a little bit higher, so that it's looking straight at me rather than me looking down at it and it looking up at the ceiling. So I'll probably get an external monitor to put the monitor up there, as well as a webcam. So regardless of whether I'm sitting or standing, I have that. So that's still coming, but it's feeling really, really good. I'm back in the office now. Most of the furniture is back up. Not everything's on the wall, and some of the corkboard and the whiteboard's still there where it was before. But the sound I'll still have to play with. Now I have a plant in my office too, which is really exciting. That's going to absorb some sound. There's one bookshelf shy against the wall because the one desk has been pushed up against the wall. But there's another completely new bookshelf that Liz built in the middle of the room attached to my desk. Actually two, one major one and one smaller one, which is going to be great for sorting different materials that I need access to. A lot of them are print reference books, and some of them are even my own books where I have proofing copies and things like that are constantly rotating through. But I will share that later on once it's done, probably in another week or two as we're finalizing some of those pieces. But again, I'm also testing the acoustics in this space because there used to be carpeting in this room, and it was a pretty solid room. And now, because it doesn't have the carpeting anymore, I'm wanting to check that out. So if the sound is a little bit different, let me know. Let me know if you like it or not, or if you can even tell the difference. The office is actually above the garage, and Liz is in the garage today doing more woodworking and construction. So every once in a while, you might even pick up the saw or drill or something that she's doing down there. There was a comment from episode 85 that came from Vale, And Vale said, you talking about the different terms people use in different countries or parts of the same country reminds me of two little stories. My mom is Canadian, so when she moved to the US, someone asked her what aisle the soda was down. She thought they meant baking soda. So she told them aisle 7, near the pop maybe? I grew up in Florida, so soda sounds normal to me, though I still say soda pop if I'm around my relatives. But when I went to Texas, my future spouse would often say, would you like a Coke? Since the only drink that you can reliably get in Texas is Dr. Pepper, I'd always say, no thank you, but a Dr. Pepper would be nice. I think she was about ready to kill me before she realized I wasn't trying to be obnoxious. I'd literally never heard anyone call a soft drink Coke before. My protest of, but the only drink they serve in this state is Dr. Pepper. Why aren't you calling them peppers instead of Cokes? Fell on deaf ears. Thanks, Vale, for that comment. It is funny how different terms can be interpreted in different ways. Again, I love the fact that soda, you think of baking soda or, maybe even, cream soda. One of the favorite pops of mine when I was a child. We had this thing called Pop Shop, which was back in the day of, Pepsi and Coke, and I think Dr. Pepper and 7-Up and Mountain Dew, I think were the only sort of flavors of Coke out there. Coke, of pop out there, or soda. And there was a company, at least in Ontario, Canada, called Pop Shop. And they had these funky little bottles that you would go to specific retailers and pick up, and you could get all these different flavors. You could get white cream soda and a pink or red cream and root beer and a whole bunch of different flavors. That was lime, I remember, was one of the popular ones. But this is back in the early day when there weren't a lot of varieties of flavors. And so that thinking about those flavors and thinking about that. Now, again, it was called Pop Shop, not Soda Shop. So you could tell it was something from my area of the woods, at least. But thanks, Vale, for that comment. Speaking of comments, there's still time to win a copy of Patrick's book from that episode, Cops and Writers, which we talk about in detail, just by commenting on episode 84. You can even ask Patrick a question about his expertise on police life for authors, and he'll answer that on the comments of that blog. Now, you have until the end of the day on July 31st, 2019 to leave that comment for a chance to win the prize. And of course, if you're a patron of the show, commenting on episode 84 gets you an extra chance to win a print copy, because all patrons will get entered in a chance to win the print copy without doing anything except for being an awesome patron of the show. So thank you so much, patrons. Your generosity helps pay for my time in the show, and extra money from that ends up going back into the Stark Reflections writing community for prizes for patrons, as well as for prizes for listeners to the show. So thank you for being patrons, thank you for being listeners, and thanks for commenting. Just a reminder that if you are a patron of the show, you'll not only have the pride and excitement of being a patron and knowing that you're supporting other writers in that way, as well as myself on the show, you get access to additional content as well, including backlist content, which includes half a dozen reflections on other podcasts, special short episodes that I release, the entire content of my audiobook, the 7 P's of Publishing Success. Now that's both the computer synthesized version and then the later human narrated one that I did, as well as sneak peeks of future audiobooks that'll be coming out, and more than 30 other patron-only posts and content that's shared just with patrons of the show. So thank you guys so much for being patrons, and thank you for being listeners of the show. Now, as I said, the patrons help pay for my time in producing the show, but the show also has a corporate sponsor, and Findaway Voices sponsors the show's hosting fees, basically where the podcast is hosted, because you have to pay for disk space online to get the episodes out in the world. And so here's a word about this episode's sponsor. Findaway Voices is an audiobook distribution platform that not only allows you the opportunity to find a professional narrator to work with, should you be looking for one, or if you have already produced your own audiobook and it's ready to go, you can use Findaway Voices for distribution. They distribute to the major places like Audible, Apple Books, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Google, etc., as well as a variety of library markets. And your book will be available in a global audiobook market where, for the majority of the platforms, Audible being one of the ones that is excluded, you'll be able to control your price. And if you want to check out ways that you can leverage Findaway voices as an indie author, check them out over at starkreflections.ca/Findaway. And now, without further ado, let's get to the main content for this episode. I do a lot of one-on-one consultations with authors, and I work with different clients to help them answer questions about the business of writing and publishing. And one of the things that came up recently, it actually came up quite a lot as I've been doing a lot more one-on-one author consultations, is answering questions that authors have about books in bookstores and dealing in books in bookstores. And the question is can an indie author get their book into bookstores? And specifically, one of the questions came from a fellow Canadian who was asking about Chapters. Now, Chapters is part of Chapters Indigo Coles, which is a major chain. So what I've done is in the response that I sent, I sort of readapted that back and thought this could be valuable content for other authors to learn rather than just giving it to one person. This could be something that can be shared, and maybe it's something that you can find valuable. So if I say the word Chapters and you're Canadian, you probably understand what I mean. If you're American, think Barnes & Noble. If you're from the UK, think W.H. Smith. If you're from France, think a company like Fnac, or in Italy, Mondadori, etc. But basically, when I say Chapters, I may be referring to like large chain bookstores as well. So what this is just sort of an overview of getting books into bookstores. Now, the best way, ultimately, to get books into bookstores is having a traditional publishing deal. But that's not the only way. Now, for my own sake, I traditionally publish, Dundurn is the largest publisher that I traditionally publish with. And one of the reasons I like working with Dundurn, apart from the good people there and the editorial team, etc., is that they already have an existing relationship, and in Canada, they have a distributor, UTP, University of Toronto Press. Basically, there is a distribution platform within Canada, UTP, and I know that Dundurn uses Ingram in the US, and they use a combination of warehoused titles, but they also have, it's a really cool thing that publishers can do where they actually maybe do the initial run as a regular print run, and there may be stock in warehouses, but then what they do is they can also say, if you run out of stock, just use the print-on-demand service. So basically just-in-time inventory if stock is run out. And that's usually going to be for authors like me, where the volume is not going to be as high. If it was a big-name author that commands tens of thousands of copies to be available, they're obviously not going to use print-on-demand. They're going to use larger print runs that cost them less money. But again, as a backup, in the case where something happens and the author wins a major award, or Oprah talks about it, or it hits number one on the New York Times bestseller list and every bookseller in the country is selling it, that could potentially mean they may be temporarily out of stock while they're doing the regular print run. And at the very least, a company like Ingram can offer publishers the ability to have a backup print on demand while the stock is waiting, which is kind of a cool thing. And that's something that I learned recently at a BISG meeting when I was in New York. But apart from traditional publishers, how can you, as an indie author, work with bookstores? Now, the same may hold true even if your book is available through a publisher. So, for example, some of my books that are available from Dundurn, some of the same things apply in terms of talking to and interacting with a bookstore. The only difference is when I'm interacting with a local bookstore here in Cambridge, for example, I can share the fact that these books are available to order through Dundurn, and I know that they order once a week from Dundurn, or once every 2 weeks, or whatever. So that's the only difference. You still have to follow much of the advice. It's still about relationships, etc. So as I said, there are multiple ways to get into chain bookstores, like Chapters, Indigo, Barnes & Noble. It often depends on the local management of those chain stores. As I said, the absolute best way to get into bookstores is to have a traditional publisher, and that just means because there's less of the painstaking groundwork that you have to do, because that's already taken care of, and that's why I say that. Now, everything else involves a lot of manual work, a lot of hitting the street, and a gigantic number of hoops and bells and whistles. Now, Chapters Indigo and Barnes & Noble, do have consignment opportunities. Some of the stores will make it easy, and the consignment's usually set up by head office, and then they're given to the stores on how they're going to manage it. Some of the stores make it hard, and some of them make it easy. Thus, it's best to have a solid relationship with a local store first before you check on things like this. Because having relationships helps make things easier. It's easier to talk to somebody you know about something than to approach them as a stranger. But even if you have a relationship, even then, a lot of it depends on the management. Yes, there are head office policies and there's procedures, etc. And some stores follow them to a T, to a letter. Others will make flexible changes to the policy in order to better serve their local community. I'll give you an example about this. When I was a product manager for Chapters many, many years ago, there were policies about setting up new vendors and buying books. There were consignment opportunities. But I wanted to have local books represented in my store, and I had a section that was just dedicated to local interest books and books by local authors. So it was, nonfiction local interest books of the Ancaster, Hamilton area, but also any books that were by authors from Hamilton, Burlington, in that region. I wanted them to be featured right at the front of the store because, to me, that was an important element of being part of the community, was focusing on local authors. And so different chain stores and independent stores have different ways of approaching that and celebrating that. Now, independent bookstores can be even more varied than chain bookstores. They are, like indie authors, independent, small business people. They need to pay the rent. They need to pay their utility and shipping bills. They need to pay their staff. They need to pay the rent or mortgages for their homes, not for the business location. They need to feed their families. It's often easier to see their stores the way you see your author business. Money spent to run the business versus money earned to pay everything and actually have something left over at the end of the month so they can stay alive and continue to do business. So unlike folks who work for corporate bookstores, indie bookstore owners are that much more vested in the success of their store. It is, after all, their money they have invested in and are spending to keep the store running. Which means, in some cases, they're going to be far more conservative in terms of taking risks. It's not somebody else's money. It's not the corporation's money. It's their money that they're risking. In other cases, because of the same factor, it also means they have far more flexibility. They have far more creativity. They have far more openness to trying new things because it's their business, not a business they manage for a corporation in New York or Toronto, etc. Now, I've worked with indie booksellers from across Canada and the US, and I can tell you that there are as many different styles, types, and approaches in indie bookselling as the uniqueness that exists in the different ways that authors approach the craft of writing and the business of writing. They're as unique and wonderful and varied as authors are. If you don't like the idea of somebody judging you as a self-published author, or maybe as a romance author, or a ghost story author, or a horror author, or a science fiction author, or anything that takes away your uniqueness and your individuality, consider that when thinking of booksellers, whether they're indie or chain bookstore folks, that most of them were drawn to that industry. They were drawn to that business, not for the riches and the money, because like authors, most of them aren't rich, but for the love and for the passion. Yeah, imagine that. In the same way that you're passionate about storytelling, about writing, they are passionate about reading and about sharing their love of reading with others. One of the most precious experiences you can have as a bookseller is when you put the right book into the right customer's hands. It's a truly magical moment when that connection can happen. It's the same way that you can have that magical connection with a reader who just gets exactly what you've written. They actually understand it. They get it. It's a magical moment. And that's what booksellers live for. The same way that writers live for that connection with their readers, which is really powerful and really important. So consider that. They were drawn to bookselling the same way you were drawn to writing. Now, as I said, and this bears repeating because it's important, these booksellers are more like you than it might first appear. no chain bookseller or independent bookstore, regardless of whether they own their own bookstore or work for a corporate bookstore, they usually were drawn there because of passion for reading for books. Yes, there will be employees that were there because it's a retail job and they needed a part-time job. But for the most part, the thing that drew them there was the books. Because, let me tell you, it's usually not the money in most cases. Now, no chain bookseller or independent bookstore is going to order copies of a book through Amazon, which is why Ingram Spark is a really good option for authors. Now, Ingram is the world's largest book wholesaler, and pretty much 99% of all English language bookstores have an account with Ingram, and therefore they can easily order in stock from them. You can get your books into Ingram directly through Ingram Spark, or you can get it to Ingram through other sources. Now, a lot of people ask about KDP Print, and KDP Print ends up using a similar distribution strategy. However, they limit it in a way that makes it preferable to Amazon and not preferable to the bookstores. So even KDP Print, what used to be CreateSpace, even their extended distribution is not the ideal way to get in there. If you want the ideal way, one of the best ways for independent authors is to use a process like Ingram Spark. Now, Draft to Digital Print is in beta right now, and Draft to Digital partners with IPG, which is basically a small publisher wholesaler that works with Ingram and uses Ingram for distribution. So if you're getting your books into Ingram through Draft to Digital Print, the difference is there's free ISBNs and it doesn't cost you anything for setup. However, you don't have as many choices as you would have using Ingram Spark. And so I like to think of it as a Ingram Spark Ultra Light, because you get the most common trim sizes, you get trade paperbacks, you don't get opportunities for hardcovers or different styles and color interiors and all the choices and bells and whistles that Ingram offers you. Even doesn't offer you the same sort of control that Ingram offers, but at least allows your book into extended distribution in a way that costs you nothing and allows bookstores to be able to order the books. Now, coming back to Ingram, when you're direct with Ingram, and that's because I'm familiar with how this works, with Ingram Spark, when the book is set up at Ingram, it means the bookstore can order the book. With Ingram Spark, you can offer a 40% to 55% discount on the book, and that makes it more attractive to bookstores. But the big clincher, and this is always the big catch, is the non-returnable default status of most print-on-demand books. Now, you can't change that status through extended distribution through Amazon, and you can't change that through the distribution that Draft to Digital has through IPG to Ingram. And most bookstores will not order non-returnable stock. They will make exceptions, but most of them won't by default, so it's good to understand that going in. The only things that bookstores order is non-returnable, because in the book industry, returns have been an integral part of the industry. It's something that started in the Great Depression to encourage publishing and bookstores to order lots of stock, even though they couldn't afford it, because they knew that there was no risk that they could return the books for a full credit back to the publishers. And that is something that has persisted in the book industry, and unlike any other retail environment. Now, the margins on books are a lot smaller, but the other stock that bookstores get that are non-returnable usually come with a big discount. So think about that tchotchke and gift crap and stationery and things that they carry. Now that's usually because the markup on that stuff, on the stationery, on the gift crap, is often 75% to 300% marked up. I.e., with a book, let's pretend a book is $10. The bookstore pays $6 for that, and the $4 is their profit margin. That's usually how that works. But let's say there is a gift item for $10 that's on the shelf there. It's some sort of, a magnet or something. Maybe that magnet costs the bookstore 50 cents, and they sell it for $10. So even if they sell that book at 50 or 75% off, they're still turning a profit on that merchandise, which is why you're constantly seeing gift merchandise marked down. You're seeing that in many, many reasons because they need to clear their inventory. They're stuck with it, and they're still, in some cases, they are losing money once they get it to a certain point. That's just to clear the stock because they can't do anything with it. Whereas with books, they can return them to the publisher. The exception to this are remainders. And those are usually those books you see at the front of bookstores that are hardcovers and trade paperbacks that have been dramatically marked down, and they usually have consistent bold stickers that advertise you can get a hardcover for $5 or something like that. Now, there's an entire business of remainders, and what that comes from in a nutshell is, let's say a book comes out in hardcover. We'll use Stephen King as an example. So they print 5 billion copies of the new Stephen King book. It's hardcover, and in Canada, the hardcover would be $45. And so the book goes out there, and millions and millions and millions of copies sell. But then at the end, there's always leftover stock, and because another print run went and they didn't sell the full print run, so the bookstores return the book, because usually within 12 months, publishers like to have a book in hardcover for at least one Christmas season, the big gift-giving season. So usually 12 months later, the mass market or the trade paperback comes out, and therefore the publisher is stuck in a warehouse with these hardcovers. Let's say they have 10,000 hardcovers left or 100,000 hardcovers left. Well, they need to make room for new books because there's constantly new books coming in, so they need to get rid of them. So there are remainder companies that will say, well, we'll take all 100,000 copies and we'll give you 50 cents for those. And then those remainder companies sell those back to bookstores and distribution platforms for a few dollars. And so when you see a hardcover, let's say that's $5 or $8 sitting at the front of the store, which was, that book from a year and a half ago from Stephen King in hardcover, whereas the mass market is $8.99 and the trade paperback is maybe $14.99, but you see the hardcover for $5. That is a case where the author may have received very little or nothing for that remaindered book because of the cost terms. Like in my case, it'd be 8% I get from a publisher. Stephen King's probably getting 25% or probably has a better deal. So maybe he actually does make a little bit off those remainders, but it wouldn't mean very much money for the publisher or the author in that case. They're just trying to blow away that stock. And in those cases, when I was a bookstore, those would be the books I would actually make really good margin on, because my margin on those would usually be 50 to 80%. So that's kind of how returns work in the grand scheme of things. Now, because they can mark down remainders and non-returnable stock like gift merchandise, that gives them some more opportunities to keep cash flow going. But with books, usually with a maximum margin of 55%, they can't really mark it down. They would lose money if they did that. They even lose money technically shipping the returns back, but at least they can get a credit with the publisher so that when they go to order the next round from that publisher, maybe they have a credit for $300, and that's beneficial to them to continue to turn inventory in their stores. I'm not going to get into the logistics of it because I used to do that for a living, is calculating returns and investment and all that stuff and operating within a budget. And that's what bookstores have to do in a very cyclical fashion. Now, in 2004, I self-published a print-on-demand title, One Hand Screaming. It was a collection of short stories, and I did it through Ingram Lightning Source. Now, this was way before Ingram Spark was even a spark in Robin Cutler's eyes. CreateSpace, which had been founded in South Carolina in 2000, was not even yet acquired by Amazon. Just to give you some context and some history on how early this was in terms of the indie author movement. There was no indie author movement. There was traditional publishing, and there was vanity publishing, and there was this pseudo self-publishing that I was involved in that hadn't yet become a thing. But I made that book when I set it up fully returnable through Ingram. Now, I'd worked as a bookseller after all, and I knew that most bookstores wouldn't touch it if it was non-returnable. I also hid the fact that it was self-published, and which is why I created the Stark Publishing imprint. Now, in case you haven't heard this one, my best friend Steve, who's a graphic designer, designed the logo for Stark Publishing and for my very first book cover, One Hand Screaming. And he did it all for a case of beer, which around the time was still under $30 Canadian. So that's like less than $25 US. Now, when we were kids, Steve and I dreamed of owning a company. He wanted to be an animator. I wanted to be a writer. And we had visions of this company we would own one day called Stark Entertainment. And Stark was a combination of our names, Steve and Mark. Steve got the first two letters. I got the last three. So that's where Stark came from. When we were in university, we used the name for a DJ company that we operated part-time, Stark Entertainment, funny enough. Now, we DJ'd a variety of teen dances, weddings, company Christmas parties. Now, this was back in the day of DJing using cassettes. We had 2 tape decks, rented a mixing board and an amp system, as well as larger speakers. We had a pair of smaller speakers from our living room that we also used for different halls. And I'll draw a parallel here that to us DJing using cassette tapes and the 2 decks was kind of akin to when I started writing with an Underwood typewriter. Now, I started writing in the early days. So the parallel would be, typing a manuscript, mailing it to the publisher with a self-addressed stamped envelope, and then going through that process over and over, which was a long, harder process than the digital world has allowed us. Of course, back in the day, we also walked 10 miles to school, uphill, in 12 feet of snow, both ways. Oh, and we wore an onion on our belt, because that was the style at the time.
So I tied an onion to my belt, which was the style at the time. Now, to take the ferry cost a nickel, and in those days, nickels had pictures of bumblebees on them. Give me 5 bees for a quarter, you'd say. Now, where were we? Oh, yeah. The important thing was that I had an onion on my belt, which was the style at the time. They didn't have white onions because of the war. The only thing you could get was those big yellow...
But I realize I got into a sidetrack and I sound a little bit like Grandpa Simpson. But anyway, so Steve and I even had business cards printed up, and this is back before Vistaprint, when, it cost quite dearly to make business cards. And here I thought, as a student at the time, that it would set me apart as sophisticated, and I'd be irresistible to the ladies. Yeah, well, that didn't work out. In any case, when I wanted to self-publish in 2004, when it wasn't cool to self-publish, I hid behind Stark Publishing. I didn't want anyone to know I was self-publishing. Making the book returnable meant that I could call a store in a city I was planning on traveling to, usually 1 to 2 to 3 months in advance, to let them know I was available to do a signing. Now, lunchtime signings for downtown locations, evening or weekend signings for stores outside the downtown core, usually in an outlying rural area. You see, it pays to understand the time of day for foot traffic in different stores. It's something I learned from my own experience working in downtown locations as well as outlying malls and box stores, more on the edges of a city. So again, contacting a downtown store in Pittsburgh when I was going to be there, knowing that their traffic was most likely lunchtime people coming in between 11 and 1 o'clock, and that was an optimal time for events for them, and that maybe they even close at 5 or 6 o'clock at night. Now, I lucked out. In this process, and I set up the book, I somehow got the attention of a Chapter's head office buyer. I was working at Chapter's head office at the time, so it was relatively easy to get their attention. And I thought it was pretty cool when they ordered 300 copies of my book, One Hand Screaming, which I made full discount and fully returnable. It was great to see that. Wow, there was going to be many of the stores across Canada were going to have, a couple copies in stock, and it was awesome to me. It felt amazing. It was great to see that, but it was not so great 6 months later when half the stock was returned by the stores unsold. And ironically, this is the funny part, the returns on about 150 copies cost me as the publisher more than I earned when I'd sold the 300 copies. So I was in the red for a while, and it was difficult. Returns are costly. It almost crippled me. Thank goodness I was able to afford to pay it off because I had a full-time job. And that's one of the things that traditional publishers have over indie publishing. They have a built-in cost model that absorbs the cost of returns and allow them not to constantly go out of business. It's the 80-20 rule. 20% of the books they publish pay for the lost money on the other 80 books. It's built into their model. It's usually not built into your model as an independent publisher, as an independent author. Certainly is not built into my own model. I don't have room to lose and bleed money on some of my titles. They all have to make money in some way, shape, or form. Now, ironically, just to be clear here, there are some of my audiobook titles that haven't yet earned back because it's still early on in the game. But that's something I fully went into, fully understanding that it would be a while before I got the money back on those. But for the most part, I usually have an approach where the money I invest in the book needs to come back to me. That's kind of part of being a business person. Now, an exception that a bookseller might make for returns, and I'm going to use this story from when I was a bookstore manager at McMaster University Bookstore. And again, I didn't own the bookstore, but We operated like an independent bookstore, and I was using a budget. It wasn't my own money, but it was money that I was accountable for. And Terry Follis, who is a graduate of the McMaster University, had self-published his very first book, The Best Laid Plans. Now, Terry had done this through a vanity publishing outfit, and the book was available at a short discount to my bookstore, and also as non-returnable. Now, because he was an alumnus, and I had listened to his book via podcast and knew it was excellent, I ordered in 30 copies of it. And I had him come in and do a book signing. I was really excited to have him come in and doing the book signing, knowing full well I could be stuck with the stock if they didn't sell. Now, ironically, Terry ended up winning the Stephen Leacock Medal for Humor for that book, so it wasn't an issue to sell it. But most of the time, unless the bookseller has a reason to believe that the book is a guaranteed seller, they won't order a book that is non-returnable. If they do, it'll likely be a single copy that is spined in the store and not really merchandised or promoted. It's almost as likely to sell a copy off the online store that someone has to find it in, like Amazon, the world's biggest bookstore, unless someone's specifically looking for it and asking for it. So again, just having the book in the store without having an audience for it, or somebody in the store that's passionate about that, the way I was passionate about Terry's books, may not get you what you want, unless all you want and you're happy with just having the book in the store, even if it means you ended up costing a bookseller good faith because they ordered a book, then they had to pulp it and they lost all their money on it. However that works. So that's getting the book in through Ingram. You can potentially do consignment. The risk with consignment is that, and you check the terms of the contract, but most consignment means you drop off, let's say, 5 copies of your book, you fill out a consignment form, and you're liable for those books. The bookstore does not own them. They are not liable for them. So if somebody comes in and a shoplifter steals all 5 copies of the book, too bad for you. It's your lost money, not the store's lost money. If they sell the books, you get a cut of the commission on the sales. And some bookstores that I've worked with will cut you a check right then and there. Some of them will send it to head office and it'll take 9 months to process. Some of them will ask you to invoice them. There's no one way that bookstores do this, so it's good to be aware when you're talking to them about consignment, how they do consignment. Some of the authors that I've been speaking to who work with some bookstores, they even allow the author to use a Square reader and just sell the books directly, because sometimes just having an author in the store means foot traffic for the store, and they're fine with that. So again, there's common ways that bookstores order stock. There's consignment, there's Ingram, and there's even other ways that your local bookstore may do in their own different way. It's good to get to know them, because then you can learn what works for them and maybe adapt a process that is profitable for both you and for the bookstore. So here are some overall ways to get a book into a bookstore, which involve a variety of common elements. And I sort of have 7 elements here for that. Now, number 1, a positive relationship with that bookstore. Ideally, it's usually with a neighborhood bookstore. It starts with relationships. It starts with knowing that bookstore. It starts with being part of that community. It's not all that different than things you suggest about using social media as a community rather than trying to just hawk and sell things to other people, rather than trying to use it as a broadcast platform. It's about relationships. It's about connections. It's about community. Number 2, have a book that speaks to the local bookseller as the perfect book that will match their clientele's reading and buying preferences, i.e., this is a book that solves their biggest problem, which is basically, when someone comes into my store, how can I ensure they walk out having purchased a book? And then how can I ensure that they return to buy another book in the near future because it was such an awesome book that they loved that experience? That's the issue. That's the problem that your book is solving for that bookstore. And if you can't figure out a way that your book solves that problem, you're missing something. It's easy with nonfiction to figure out what that problem is, but when it comes to fiction, the problem is often the right escape or the right enjoyment or the right pastime that the person wants to do. Number 3, further to the point that I just mentioned in number 2, finding the right bookseller within the store that is carrying the book, who is passionate about the book, and who knows that others will love it too. Now, when I had stock of Terry Follis's The Best Laid Plans, we didn't sell more than a handful of copies at the book signing. But because I'd read and loved the book, considering it a delightful cross between Robertson Davies and John Irving, I was able to hand sell copies of the book to the right customers who came into my store in the weeks that passed who also loved it. Now, setting up the book with as big a discount as possible via Ingram Spark, Ingram being the wholesaler that most booksellers have access to, means they're taking less of a chance because the cost would be lower, and maybe that's amortized over time. So if they order in 30, maybe they only have to sell 15 copies to make their money back, and they're in the black rather than being in the red. Number 4, consider making the book fully returnable, which I do not advise. I've been bit by it because it can cost you more in the long run. Considering just going with the local bookstore's consignment options, which is a lot of manual work on a part as well as a big risk, may be an alternative option. So again, considering making it fully returnable, but understanding the huge risk that you're taking. Considering consignment, but understand the risk that you're taking on consignment. 5, persistence. A lot of hitting the street, a lot of research, a lot of footwork, a lot of being out there, talking to, communicating with, interacting with, and maybe even selling to local bookstores. Now, timing is everything, and this is something you can't predict. It involves a lot of trial and tribulations and sweat and blood and tears and more blood and more blood and more sweat and more sweat and more tears. Number 6, the right bookseller at exactly the right time, caught in the right mood. Yeah, that's a tough one. Hard to set up the tables for. However, you're not going to walk into a bookstore on December 24th at 3 in the afternoon, 2 hours before it closed, and say, hey, would you like to carry my book? I have it here. Could you sign this form? And you'd probably be talking to the bookseller through a gigantic lineup of customers who are there to buy books. So again, you can think about retail environments and when the busy times are and when the quiet times are easiest to know, even if you've never worked retail, by actually spending time in the store. And you can use that knowledge to figure out a good time, or maybe asking to set up an appointment. When would be a good time for me to meet with you to talk about my book? That sort of thing could be awesome and could help you get the right bookseller at the right time in the right mood. And number 7, finally, luck. Lots and lots of luck. Interestingly enough, luck usually comes after a lot of hard work, a lot of research, a lot of patience, and a lot of persistence. It is possible for you to get your book into bookstores. It's not easy. It's a lot of work, and it will take some luck, but it is possible. Well, that's the end of episode 87, look at bookstores. I got into a little bit more of the background of bookselling. I thought that might be a useful thing to understand. It may or may not be a useful thing for you to understand in terms of understanding the business of running a bookstore, but I think insights can always lend themselves towards helping you come out with a fully fleshed plan for when you're wanting to work with bookstores. I was listening as well to the audio, and I was actually checking to see how the acoustics sound in the new setup as I continue to set up the new office. So if you have any comments on that, please let me know. Although I did pick up the sound of Liz hammering. She was putting an addition to the fence because one of our dogs and one of the dogs in the yard behind us aren't getting along too well. And the other dog's actually able to leap up and bite Indiana over the fence. And so we added an additional 1 foot extension to the top of the fence. And of course, Liz didn't do the half-assed job that I would do by just putting up some lattice. She actually made it look really good. But you can actually hear her hammering from the backyard during some of that towards the end of what I was doing. And it was funny because I could hear it. So I closed the window in my room, which is at the front of the house, and she was at the back. I went in, I closed from across the hall, the bathroom window, the bathroom door, the door to my office, and then also the window, but you could still hear it, which gotta love this mic in terms of picking it up, but it's also challenging when there's stuff like that going on. So I hope that wasn't too distracting. Speaking of distracting, when I was going into backstory and I got into the background for Stark and that brand name that I use, I went a little Grandpa Simpson, and my apologies for the little sidetrack of back in the day. But of course, it's always fun when you can make fun of yourself, which is why I pulled that quote from Simpsons episode. In any case, I hope you found that valuable. Let me know if you found that to be useful, because I also planned on doing a future episode where I talk a little bit more about libraries and how do you get your book into libraries. And in terms of libraries, because there's a lot more flexibility and there's better tools for that. I know Kobo has a great ebook program with the Independent Booksellers Association in the US, but there's maybe only 600 bookstores involved in that, and not every bookstore really understands ebooks the way they understand print. But at least with libraries, the audio and ebook and print, and I wanted to talk about strategies for dealing with libraries. So if you think that would be useful, do please let me know. And again, hope you found this episode useful. If you enjoy the podcast, one of the best ways you can do to support me is actually to share this podcast, to let a friend know, particularly a friend that you think would find value in the content for this episode. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Stark Reflections on Writing and Publishing podcast. Again, this is Mark Leslie Lefebvre, and here's wishing you great writing and good Stark Reflections.
Thank you for listening to the Stark Reflections podcast. You can find show notes for each episode at starkreflections.ca.
The music for this podcast, Laser Groove, was composed and produced by Kevin MacLeod. Check out more of Kevin's great music at incomptech.com.